Hello again. So we're going to continue with climate smart agriculture and what's its role in Costa Rica's carbon neutrality plans? How can Costa Rica use climate smart agriculture in order to meet its 2050 goals for being completely carbon neutral? So you might remember from our energy lecture, you saw this graph. So now the only thing that I've done is that instead of highlighting the transport and energy sectors, I'm just highlighting the AFOLU sector. So what is AFOLU? AFOLU stands for Agriculture, Forestry, and Other Land Uses. And in carbon neutrality studies, these things get all grouped together into one role. So as you can see it for the emissions that you get from this sector, from the AFOLU sector, Costa Rica estimates that only 2% of its emissions come from there. So you might wonder, so why even bother? Just concentrate on the transportation system and you can get to your carbon neutrality, or look at your industry. Why focus on farming? Now we have to kind of deconstruct what this AFOLU stands for in order to understand what the impact of farming is, because AFOLU means a lot of things, from cattle to agriculture for food production, agriculture for industrial products like timber, to conservation, because forests, all of the forests, including the 50% of Costa Rica's territory that's under tree cover, are all bunched into this. Now, this is a problem because when you do the balance, you have Costa Rica's largest carbon sink being attributed only to the AFOLU sector, not to the whole country, but only there. So let's see where these AFOLU emissions come from. So mostly it comes from uh, opening up new pastures, enteric fermentation from cattle, opening up new croplands, and you can see the whole thing. But then you have this huge sink there. So you have about almost 6,000 gigatons that of carbon equivalents that get captured by the forest lands in Costa Rica. And these have nothing to do with agricultural production. So we need to separate forest and conservation out of agriculture, out of the AFOLU sector, in order to understand what the role of farming actually is. So I'm going to take away those green ones and we'll see how that matters. So the balance, if you include conservation in the AFOLU sector, is about 464 gigatons per year. These are data for 2015. Numbers probably have not changed very much in the last 5 years. Now I'm going to take away those forest lands, and we don't have 464 gigatons anymore. We have 6,945 gigatons. That's a lot. That's about 40% of the net emissions. So if we consider AFOLU with the conservation sector in it, with all these national parks and secondary and primary forests that we have in the country, as part of it, it becomes really small and it kind of gets shoved away. But these agriculture doesn't have anything to do with conservation in the sense of how do you manage it. If we look at it, then just the gross emissions are about 40%. So farming is almost as big as transportation if we take away forestry from it. That's a very worrisome number because we need to do something about it in order to be carbon neutral. We can't just say, oh, the forests are taking care of that. Let's see. The first and most uh, abundant source of emissions from farming in Costa Rica for 2015 was land use change. And this is a country where land use change is against the law. You cannot, by law, cut a forest and build a farm and make a pineapple plantation or put in some cattle. Still, it's happening. In 2015, it was estimated that about 10,000 hectares of land were cleared. This is not in one place, of course. This is 1 hectare here, 300 hectares there, something uh, like that. Not just like one huge clearing, but this is a lot of land. This 10,000 hectares is larger than many national parks in the country. And according to the carbon inventory for that year, that's what was cleared. And that entails when you cut down the forest, eventually the carbon that was stored in these trees just dissipates into the atmosphere and becomes an emission. So land use change is one of the main things, one of the main causes of emissions for farming in Costa Rica. Just a parenthesis, imagine what happens in countries where this is legal and the areas of land are a lot larger, like Brazil or countries in Central Africa. This is a very worrisome source of carbon because it's one of the larger ones for the whole world, not just for Costa Rica. Well, anyhow, how can climate smart agriculture help this? One is by enforcing this, by using technology to enforce laws. So the Costa Rican law already has it in it that you cannot do this. This is against the law. But how do you prove this? It's really hard to go to these remote areas and make sure that the people are not cutting down the forest. But we do have satellite images. We can get them almost on a daily basis and see where land is being cleared. Now, sustainable intensification also can prevent the demand for new farmland. That's one of the main pillars of climate smart agriculture. And here you have a silvopasture system, which is kind of what this is. It's a land sharing, but again, it's also a land sparing technique at the same time because you can have cattle that is growing under trees. This creates habitat for animals. But what does it do for climate? For one thing, you have different varieties of grasses that grow under shade. And counterintuitively to what traditional farmers think that if you have grass under shade, it's not productive. These grasses are shade tolerant. They are actually more nutritious than the sun grown grasses. So you can have more heads of cattle per unit of area in one of these silvopastoral systems than you have in an open range system, which is very wasteful. Plus, you have your mitigation going on where you have your trees that are producing timber for the farmer and also shade for the cows. Shade makes cows more productive if they are dairy cattle and they grow faster because they don't spend energy just trying to get cooled down in the sun. And you get an extra product, which increases the productivity per unit area. So that is one example of what could be done here in Costa Rica, not to ban cattle, but just to disencourage farmers from having to go and clear forest for new farmland. The second source of emissions is enteric fermentation, and that is a big problem worldwide. What is enteric fermentation? That is the process by which cows can digest grass and other animals like sheep as well. So they have bacteria in their guts that do the digesting of these really hard cellulose in grass, and that creates methane. Most of us organisms we can't eat grass because we don't have those bacteria, and we produce methane, but in a far less amounts than cows. So these bacteria in their gut, they are just these methanogenic bacteria that produce large amounts. It's good for the cow because it gets to eat things that most other animals can't eat and turn it into cow biomass, which is what we use. But as you all know, methane is about 25 times more harmful for the environment, for the atmosphere, than carbon dioxide. So the methane coming out of the cow's back end and out of their burps just goes into the atmosphere, and this is huge. This is a huge source, and people might say, "Do cows burp that often?" And you can look it up online. Look, you just YouTube cows burping, and you can see how often they burp and how much they burp. Anyhow, how can we improve this? Climate smart agriculture encourages the use of uh, technology for, well, first of all, giving cows better food. There are many varieties of grasses that cows can eat, and many types of foods that cow can eat that are not grasses that are actually more digestible for them and their bacteria. And when this happens, then they produce less methane, and more of it gets produced into cow biomass, which increases the productivity of the farm, and there are less gases coming out of the cow's burps and farts. Now, gut fauna management is another one. We can genetically modify and select the bacteria that go into these cows, and we can reduce up to 30 or more percent the amount of gas that these bacteria are producing by choosing the more efficient bacteria to live in our cows. And we're not cutting all of the emissions, but we're definitely reducing them by a significant amount. And enteric fermentation is hard to manage because you can't like stick a bag into the cow's back end and hope that we capture all the methane coming out of it and then have cows walking around with balloons stuck to them. But uh, we can, however, reduce the amount of methane they actually produce. In my opinion, we should reduce the amount of cows that we need for living as a human species, and just reducing the amount of beef and dairy products that we consume can go a longer way than managing their guts. But if we're talking climate smart agriculture, this is the solution that we propose. The next source of emission is manure management. And you guys already talked about the biodigester with Pablo, and he showed you the one that we have here. That's a tiny biodigester that we have here. We have a larger one for humans, but still, this is a pork farm in the Central Valley of Costa Rica. And this is an industrial pork farm. They have thousands of pigs there. And what they do is they actually accumulate the methane from the pigs into their biodigesters, and they use that to power their own plant. They produce their own electricity. So it's a very interesting way of making themselves more profitable, also better for the environment. Just to highlight, does this actually help in the environment? I mean, we're still burning the methane, and it's still going as CO2 into the atmosphere, but precisely that's the point. We're not just getting energy and getting more money out of having biodigesters. Think about the impact that we're having. Methane is 25 times more harmful to the environment, to the atmosphere, than CO2. And when we burn it, we're just taking away that methane and combining it, releasing energy, combining it with the oxygen in the atmosphere and releasing CO2. So we're not reducing the impacts completely, but we're reducing them by 25 times. So this is a very important technology in terms of livestock production. What can we do about agricultural soils? Where do the emissions come in agricultural soils? Well, mostly they are coming from the fertilizer that we're putting in them. I mentioned in the previous lecture that nitrogen is not a very common element in soils. Actually, we only get it from nitrogen fixing bacteria that take it from the little pores in the soil from the air and fix it from the atmosphere and provide it to plants. Or we sometimes get it from lightning. Lightning causes nitrogen to fix into the raindrops and it falls as a fertilizer. But it's still very rare and it's a very limiting element. So the other way of getting nitrogen is getting natural gas and extracting the nitrogen out of there. And that is very impactful for the atmosphere. And when we put it into the ground, it's very inefficient. Plants take up only a tiny amount of the nitrogen fertilizers that we use on them, and the rest of it goes into the soil or kind of gets decomposed by the environment in the soil and gets emitted as nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is even worse than methane for the atmosphere. Its heating potential is, I don't know the exact number, I don't have it with me, but it's about 200 times higher than it is for uh, carbon dioxide. So it's a really harmful gas. Climate smart agriculture has solutions for this. Remember that climate smart agriculture is not about cutting cold turkey on things, but rather using our technology more wisely. So what can we do? What you have here, this is an image taken by a drone and analyzed using spectral analysis, where we take the radiation emitted by the leaves of the crops, and from that analysis we can say where the fertilizer is needed the most. Where do plants need more nitrogen fertilizer? So in this case it would be the red areas. So using technology for precision agriculture will allow us to, instead of fertilizing the whole field, just looking at the red areas and applying fertilizer where it's needed and the right amounts that it's needed. That can help us reduce a lot of our emissions and, again, increase productivity and profitability for the farmers. So what other things can we do besides precision agriculture? We can make our farmlands more integrated. Instead of buying lots of external outputs of fertilizer, we could provide part of this fertilizer with manure from our own animals or from the neighbor's farmland. We can get their manure and use it as organic fertilizer for our farmland. And that way we're not emitting that manure into the atmosphere, but rather incorporating it again into the system and getting more products out of it. Again, we're reducing an impact, not completely eliminating it, but reducing it significantly. We can also just improve the way that we apply fertilizer. Think of indoor farming. When you have hydroponics, you're giving each plant exactly the amount of fertilizer that you want. This fertilizer is still synthetic, but you're not wasting that much. You say, okay, so we have 300,000 plants. How many grams of nitrogen or potassium do we need? And you're giving the plant exactly what it needs without wasting all that and putting it into the waterways and having it dissipate into the atmosphere. So this is one way that climate smart agriculture could help Costa Rica reduce its footprint uh, in terms of emissions from agricultural soils. Finally, one of the larger sources for Costa Rica is methane production from rice. If you've ever been to Costa Rica or plan to be here, you will realize we eat a lot of rice. And a lot of this is produced here in the country. The problem with rice is that we grow wetland rice. Lowland rice, you need to flood the land, and rice grows in flooded conditions. It's a semi-aquatic plant. And then what's the problem with this? Compared to other crops, when you flood the land, you get a different kind of bacteria working in your soil. They get saturated with water, there's no oxygen, and then who kicks in? The methanogenic bacteria. And the methanogenic bacteria, of course, start producing methane instead of carbon dioxide, and then we get the large impact from rice compared to other crops. What can we do about that? Climate smart agriculture proposes two techniques. Well, more than these, but these are the most accepted one. One is the wet-dry rice techniques. The wet-dry one is that you flood the rice paddy and you give enough water for the rice, but then you just dry it up. And what does this do? It allows your rice plants to get enough water to grow, but it doesn't allow your methanogenic community of bacteria to settle in your soil. And therefore they start dying off, and you get replaced by the CO2 bacteria with aerobic bacteria, and then you flood it again to give the rice the water it needs, and you kind of keep it that way, and then you reduce a lot of your impacts. This might be logistically more complicated, so farmers may not want to apply it. The other way actually saves more water and reduces the impact of the methane. That's using raised beds techniques. So instead of having your rice inside the water, you have your rice in little furrows that you make, like you can see in this diagram, and you flood the in-between channels between the furrows. That's a lot less water, a lot less methanogenic bacteria, and then this water gets absorbed by the soil and it reaches the roots of the rice without having to have the whole plant halfway into the water. So you're using a lot less water as well, and you're reducing your impacts. So these are the ways that Costa Rica could use climate smart agriculture to reduce its impacts. Again, I would like to highlight that climate smart agriculture is a paradigm of production that is completely focused on the environment. You guys might have other questions like, okay, well, what about uh, animal rights and things like that? Because if you have pigs that are in these factory farms, they are actually more climate smart than having your pigs running around and pooping everywhere. In a factory farm, you can actually get your methane, your manure, and put it into a biodigester. If your pigs are just wandering around happily, then that's good for the pigs, but it's not good for the environment. So climate smart agriculture again is focused on the climate, not necessarily on other aspects like uh, water health or animal rights or conflicts about using transgenics or other types of fertilizers. And the other thing is precisely that there are no bans on using any kind of products in climate smart agriculture. Synthetic fertilizers are disencouraged. The same thing for synthetic pesticides. They're disencouraged, but they're still allowed. There's not like you need to go completely organic in order to do this. Uh, Also, there are no limits on the size of the farms. It doesn't mean that climate smart agriculture wants everybody to be a tiny, small, diversified farmer that only produces what they eat. It goes for large productions as well. You can be a huge industrial farmer and have this huge factory farm incorporated to this huge pineapple farm, which is not ideal for many paradigms of sustainability, but still be climate smart. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Bye.